Acts chapter 1, continued. Jesus, as we shall discover later on, made a special point of discouraging the laying of emphasis upon outer observances, and indeed upon hard and fast rules and regulations of every kind. What he insisted upon was a certain spirit in one's conduct, and he was careful to teach principles only, knowing that when the spirit is right, details will take care of themselves, and that in fact the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life, as was so obviously seen in the sad example of the Pharisees. Yet, in spite of this, the history of Orthodox Christianity is largely made up of attempts to enforce all sorts of external observances upon the people. A striking case in illustration of this is the Puritan attempt to enforce the Old Testament Sabbath upon Christians, although the Sabbath law was a purely Hebrew ordinance, and the ferocious penalties involved in neglecting it applied exclusively to the desecration of Saturday. And in spite of the fact that Jesus particularly discouraged superstitious Sabbath observance, saying that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, and making a point of doing anything that he wanted to do upon that day, he clearly indicates throughout his teaching that the time has come when man must make each and every day a spiritual Sabbath by knowing and doing all things in a spiritual light. It is obvious that even if the Hebrew Sabbath were binding upon Christians, then, since they do not observe it in keeping Sunday, they will still incur all the consequences of Sabbath breaking. Many modern Christians do, however, realize that there is no system of theology in the Bible unless one likes to put it there deliberately, and they have practically given up theology altogether, but they still cling to Christianity because they feel intuitively that it is the truth. There is really no logical justification for their attitude, since they do not possess the spiritual key which alone makes the teaching of Jesus intelligible. And so they endeavor to rationalize their attitude in various ways. This is the dilemma of the man who has neither the blind faith of orthodoxy nor the spiritual interpretation of scientific Christianity to support him. He does not have a leg to stand on that does not belong to the old-fashioned Unitarian. If he does not reject miracles altogether, he is at least very uneasy about them. They embarrass him, and he wishes they were not in the Bible at all, and would be glad in his heart to be well rid of them. A Life of Jesus, recently published by a well-known clergyman, clearly illustrates how false this position is. In the book, he concedes that Jesus may have healed some people, or helped them heal themselves, but he draws the line there. He explains away into nothingness all the other miracles. They were the usual fantastic legends that center around all great historical figures, he thinks. On the lake, for instance, the disciples were thoroughly frightened until they thought of Jesus, and the thought of him calmed their fears. This was subsequently exaggerated into an absurd tale that he had come to them in person walking upon the water. Another time, it appears, he reformed a sinner, raising him out of a grave of sin, and this was expanded years and years afterward into a ridiculous legend that he had really revived a dead man. Again, Jesus prayed fervently one night, so that he looked most radiantly happy, and Peter, who had fallen asleep, woke up with a start, and years afterward he told some confused story about believing that he saw Moses there, so much for the transfiguration, and so forth, and so forth. Now, one must extend every sympathy to the special pleadings of a man enthralled by the beauty and mystery of the Gospels, but who, in the absence of the spiritual key, seems to find his common sense and all the scientific knowledge of mankind flouted by so much that these Gospels contain. But this simply will not do. If the miracles did not happen, the rest of the Gospel story loses all real significance. If Jesus did not believe them to be possible, and undertake to perform them, never, it is true, for the sake of display, but still constantly and repeatedly. If he did not believe and teach many things in flat contradiction to 18th and 19th century rationalistic philosophy, then the gospel message is chaotic, contradictory, and devoid of all significance. We cannot ride away from the dilemma by saying that Jesus was not interested in the current beliefs and superstitions of the time, that he took them more or less for granted passively, because what really interested him was character. this is a feeble argument, because character must include both an intelligent and a vital all-round reaction to life. Character must include some definite beliefs and convictions concerning things that really matter. But the miracles did happen. All the deeds related to Jesus in the 4 Gospels did happen, and many others too, the which, if they should be written, everyone, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Jesus himself justified what people thought to be a strange and wonderful teaching by the works he was able to do, and went further, and said, referring to those who study and practice his teaching, "The works that I do, ye shall do, and greater works." Now what, after all, is a miracle? Those who deny the possibility of miracles on the ground that the universe is a perfect system of law and order, to the operation of which there can be no exception, are perfectly right. But the explanation is that the world of which we are normally aware, and with whose laws alone most people are acquainted, is only a fragment of the whole universe as it really is, and that there is such a thing as appealing from a lower to a higher law, from a lesser to a greater expression. Now, the appeal from the lower to the higher law is not really a breach of law, for the possibility of such an appeal is part of the major constitution of the universe, and therefore, in the sense of a real breach of law, miracles are impossible. Yet, in the sense that all the ordinary rules and limitations of the physical plane can be set aside or overridden by an understanding which has risen above them, miracles, in the colloquial sense of the word, can and do happen. Let us suppose, for the sake of example, that on a certain Monday, your affairs are in such a condition that, humanly speaking, certain consequences are sure to follow by the end of the week. These may be legal consequences, perhaps of a very unpleasant nature following upon some decision of the courts, or they may be certain physical consequences in the human body. A competent physician may decide that a perilous operation will be absolutely necessary, or he may even feel it his duty to say that there is no chance for the recovery of the patient. Now, if someone can raise his consciousness above the limitations of the physical plane in connection with the matter, and this is only a scientific description of what is commonly called prayer, then the conditions on that plane will change, and in some utterly unforeseen and normally impossible manner, the legal tragedy will melt away, and to the advantage, be it noted, of all parties to the case, or the patient will be healed instead of having to undergo the operation, or of having to die. In other words, miracles, in the popular sense of the word, can and do happen as the result of prayer. Prayer does change things. Prayer does make things happen quite otherwise than they would have happened had the prayer not been made. It makes no difference at all what sort of difficulty you may be in. It does not matter what the causes may have been that led up to it. Enough prayer will get you out of your difficulty if only you will be persistent enough in your appeal to God. Prayer, however, is both a science and an art, and it was to the teaching of this science and this art that Jesus devoted the greater part of his ministry. The gospel miracles happened because Jesus had the spiritual understanding that gave him greater power in prayer than anyone else before or since. One other attempt to interpret the Gospels must be taken into consideration. Tolstoy endeavored to put forward the Sermon on the Mount as a practical guide to life, taking its precepts literally at their face value and ignoring the spiritual interpretation of which he was unaware, and excluding the plane of spirit in which he did not believe. Discarding the whole of the Bible except the 4 Gospels, and discounting all miracles, he made a heroic but futile attempt to combine Christianity and materialism, and of course he failed. His real place in history turns out to be not that of the founder of a new religious movement, but that of the man whose practical anarchism, promulgated with all the fire of genius, paved the way for the Bolshevik revolution, even as Rousseau had cleared the road for the French Revolution.